There is a specific kind of silence that only exists deep in the backcountry, the kind that feels less like peace and more like holding your breath. You go out there to escape the noise of the city, to find something primal, but sometimes you find something that should have stayed lost. Tonight's story comes from the remote stretches of the North Cascades, a place where the tree line stretches on like a dark ocean against the sky. It involves three men who knew the wilderness better than most, guys who spent their entire lives reading terrain and tracking weather. They thought they were prepared for anything the mountains could throw at them. They never considered that the danger might be the very person they hired to lead them through the peaks. We trust guides because we assume they are bound by the same physical laws of survival that we are. We assume they get tired, they feel the cold, and they need to drink water just like the rest of us. But when you are miles away from the nearest cell tower, that assumption can become a fatal trap. Pull up a chair, turn down the lights, and make sure your doors are locked tight. You are about to hear exactly why you should never follow a stranger into the deep woods, no matter how highly recommended they are. Vance, Elias, and Theron were the kind of hikers who looked down on established trails and crowded national park paths. They wanted the untouched patches of the map, the jagged ridges near the Canadian border where the map topography just blurs into gray. To get there, they needed local expertise, which led them to a tiny outfitter shop at the edge of a dying logging town. The owner behind the counter barely looked up from his ledger when they asked for a backcountry routing guide. He just slid a stained business card across the glass, warning them that the man named Mercer was the only one crazy enough to go up there this late in the season. They brushed off the old man's grim tone as typical small-town theatrics meant to spook city tourists. They met Mercer the next morning at a gravel pull-off at the very end of a forgotten logging road. He was already waiting for them, standing completely motionless beside a beat-up truck that looked like it hadn't run in a decade. Mercer was a remarkably tall, thin man, wearing heavy wool layers and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a permanent shadow over his eyes. He didn't offer a handshake or a smile, just nodded slowly and pointed a long, gloved finger toward the dense tree line. Vance tried to make small talk while they loaded their heavy packs, but Mercer just ignored the banter completely. Elias figured the guy was just a socially awkward mountain hermit, which was exactly the kind of rugged authenticity they were paying for. The first few hours of the trek were punishing, forcing the three friends to focus entirely on their burning lungs and aching calves. They were climbing a steep, unmarked incline over mossy deadfall and loose shale that threatened to snap an ankle with every step. Despite carrying a massive canvas rucksack, Mercer set a blistering pace, gliding over the treacherous terrain without making a single sound. Theron was the first to notice that the guide wasn't breathing heavily, nor was he breaking a sweat despite the steep elevation gain. Every time they called for a quick water break, Mercer would just stop instantly and stand perfectly still with his back to them. He never took off his heavy canvas jacket, and he never once reached for his own canteen to take a drink. By late afternoon, the vibrant green canopy gave way to a dense, suffocating fog that clung to the gray trunks of the pines. The normal sounds of the forest, the wind rushing through the needles and the chattering of squirrels, abruptly vanished. It was an unnatural, heavy silence that made the pressure in their ears spike, as if they were deep underwater. Vance jokingly asked Mercer if they were making good time, but the guide just kept walking, his long legs moving with a strange, fluid rhythm. His footprints in the damp earth were bizarrely shallow for a man carrying that much weight, leaving barely a depression in the mud. The unease really started to set in when the sun began to dip below the jagged horizon, casting long, distorted shadows through the mist. They had been hiking for 10 straight hours, far exceeding the physical limits of a normal day on a rough trail. Elias finally dropped his pack in frustration and shouted that they needed to set up camp before it got pitch black. Mercer halted mid-stride, his head snapping around at a harsh, unnatural angle to look back at them through the gloom. He didn't argue or speak. He just slowly lowered his massive canvas bag to the ground with total silence. That was the moment Theron realized the heavy bag made no sound when it hit the rocks, as if it were completely empty. As they pitched their tents with freezing fingers, they watched their guide stand near the edge of the clearing, staring out into the dark. He didn't set up a shelter, he didn't roll out a sleeping bag, and he certainly didn't try to start a fire. Vance offered him a portion of their heated camp stew, but Mercer just slowly shook his head side to side without breaking his gaze from the trees. A deep, vibrating hum suddenly filled the air around the campsite, making the metallic zippers on their tents rattle violently. It wasn't a sound you could hear, but something you felt in your teeth and the bones of your chest. The three men retreated into their tent, zipping the nylon shut while their guide remained outside in the freezing, absolute dark. Inside the thin nylon walls of the tent, sleep was an absolute impossibility for the three men. That deep, vibrating hum continued to pulse through the rocky ground, making their teeth ache and their vision blur at the edges. Vance tried to check the GPS on his phone, only to find the screen completely black and the device burning hot to the touch. Elias pulled out his heavy-duty flashlight to signal for a retreat, but the brand-new batteries drained to zero the second he clicked the button. The dense silence outside was so absolute, it felt like a physical weight pressing against the fabric of their temporary shelter. Theron slowly unzipped the mesh window just an inch, peering out into the freezing darkness to see if their guide had finally moved. Mercer was standing in the exact same spot, but the trees around him seemed to have leaned inward, creating a claustrophobic cage of twisted wood. The dense fog had thickened into a soup that distorted the moonlight, casting bizarre, elongated shadows that seemed to stretch toward the tent. Theron squinted through the tiny opening, noticing that the space between their campsite and the guide felt completely wrong. It was as if the distance was actively shifting, compressing and expanding like a lung taking shallow, jagged breaths. Without making a sound, Mercer finally reached up with those excessively long fingers and removed his wide-brimmed hat. The back of his head was perfectly smooth, devoid of any hair or defining texture, pale like the belly of a dead fish. Elias pushed past Theron to look, his breath catching in his throat as a crushing sensation of heavy gravity suddenly glued him to the floor. The air inside the tent became dangerously thin, forcing all three men to gasp quietly while they watched the nightmare unfold outside. Mercer slowly turned his head, but his torso remained completely rigid, rotating his neck at an impossible, sickening angle of nearly 180 degrees. When his face came into view, the sheer absurdity of it shattered any remaining illusion of a rugged mountain expert. It wasn't a human face at all, but rather a crude, flattened approximation made of tight, grayish skin stretched over the wrong bone structure. There were no eyelids over those large, dark voids, and his jaw hung slightly slack, revealing rows of small, needle-like protrusions. The guide raised his gloved hand and mimicked the exact gesture Vance had used earlier to point out a landmark. The movement was terribly disjointed, like a crude animatronic puppet trying to recall how human joints were supposed to operate. That low hum vibrating through the dirt suddenly shifted into a garbled, overlapping playback of their own voices from earlier in the day. Hearing their own casual laughter and mundane complaints echoing back from the featureless face of their guide sent a primal wave of panic through the tent. It wasn't just a recording. The cadence was wrong, chopped up and rearranged into a predatory, mocking lure. Mercer began to walk toward the tent, but his long legs were bending backward at the knee, snapping through the brush with terrifying speed. The very architecture of the forest seemed to react to his movement, the heavy branches above twisting downward to block the only path back to the trail. Vance frantically grabbed his hiking axe, realizing with dreadful clarity that the old man at the shop knew exactly what he was feeding them to. They were utterly trapped in an anomaly that was actively reshaping the woods, and whatever was wearing Mercer's clothes was finally hungry. There was no logic left to appeal to, only the violent, desperate urge to break through the nylon and run into the dark. Before we go any further into this nightmare, I need you to pause for a second and listen very closely to me. If you ever find yourself booking a backcountry trip and the outfitter hands you a stained card with no phone number, turn around and drive away. Do not trust guides who refuse to eat, drink, or show their face in the sunlight, because the wilderness is full of things that only pretend to be human. I have gathered a list of specific warning signs, known anomalous territories, and the exact coordinates of that cursed logging town. You need to memorize this information before your next camping trip, so go down to the pinned comment right now and read it carefully. Your survival out there depends entirely on recognizing the trap before the forest closes its doors behind you. Once you have saved those coordinates, come back up here and make sure the lights are still on. The heavy nylon of the tent violently ripped open before Vance could even swing his axe. That pale, featureless face shoved its way through the tearing fabric, bringing with it a smell like ozone and burning hair. Theron didn't hesitate, throwing his entire body weight backward and crashing through the rear mesh window of their shelter. Elias scrambled out right behind him, leaving all their expensive gear behind in a desperate bid to just get away from that thing. They hit the freezing mud hard, scrambling on their hands and knees, while the garbled playback of their own voices screamed from inside the ruined tent. The forest had completely changed around them, with the familiar pine trees now looking twisted and utterly wrong in the dark. The three men ran blindly into the dense brush, completely abandoning the trail they had spent hours climbing. Every step felt like dragging their boots through thick sludge, as if the gravity in this part of the woods was actively working against them. Vance swung his axe wildly at the heavy branches that seemed to deliberately reach out and snag their heavy coats. Behind them, the horrific sound of whatever was wearing Mercer's clothes snapping its backwards knees echoed through the dense fog. It was moving way too fast for a human, tearing through the thickets with a sickening, wet, crunching noise. The air grew so intensely cold that their breath crystallized instantly, but the ground beneath their boots felt bizarrely hot. They slid down a steep embankment, crashing through a wall of dead brambles and landing in a dry creek bed. Theron clamped a hand over Elias's mouth, forcing him to stifle his panicked hyperventilating as they pressed their backs against a muddy overhang. Absolute, suffocating silence slammed back into the forest, cutting off the sounds of their pursuer entirely. It was the kind of quiet that made your eardrums throb, completely devoid of wind, insects, or rustling leaves. They sat there in the pitch black, gripping the wet dirt and waiting for a physical blow that felt inevitable. A few yards above them, the heavy, unnatural footsteps of the guide finally approached the edge of the ridge. The footsteps stopped directly over their heads, sending a shower of loose pebbles cascading down onto their shoulders. Vance tightened his grip on the axe handle until his knuckles turned white, silently praying that the overhang was deep enough to hide them. That deep, vibrating hum started up again, rattling the loose fillings in Elias's teeth and making his nose bleed profusely. A long, gloved hand slowly lowered from the edge of the embankment, the fingers stretching out far past normal human proportions. It was blindly feeling around in the dark, scraping those long nails against the dirt just inches from Theron's face. The garbled recording of Vance's voice suddenly whispered directly into their ears, asking if they were making good time. The sheer terror of hearing his own voice coming from that thing pushed Vance completely over the edge. He let out a ragged yell, swinging the heavy hiking axe upward and burying the blade deep into the extended, gloved hand. Instead of blood, a thick black substance sprayed out from the wound, smelling strongly of old copper and rotten wood. It jerked its arm back with alarming force, ripping the heavy tool right out of Vance's desperate grip. A horrific metallic screech tore through the canyon, completely shattering the oppressive silence and forcing the men to cover their ears. Using the brief distraction, Elias grabbed both of his friends by their jackets and yanked them down the winding creek bed. They sprinted through the darkness without any light, slipping on smooth river rocks and tearing their hands open on jagged roots. The metallic screeching behind them quickly shifted back into that mocking, chopped-up laughter, echoing from multiple directions at once. The spatial distortion was getting worse, making the narrow ravine feel like an endless, looping hallway of wet stone. Theron realized with mounting dread that the creek bed was actually curving uphill, defying every basic law of geography. They had no idea where they were going, only that stopping meant letting that fake guide catch up to them. The cold mist clung to their clothes like wet cement, dragging them down as they forced their exhausted bodies to keep moving through the impossible landscape. They scrambled up the impossible incline of the dry riverbed until their lungs burned with the taste of cold copper. Just as the heavy, crushing gravity threatened to snap their spines, the dense fog suddenly shattered like fragile glass. The agonizing silence was instantly replaced by the deafening roar of a passing logging truck on wet asphalt. Vance, Elias, and Theron tumbled out of the thick brush and collapsed onto the gravel shoulder of a two-lane highway. Pale morning light was bleeding through the overcast sky, illuminating the familiar rusted signs of the dying town they had left yesterday. They lay there in the wet dirt for a long time, staring up at the normal pine trees, while their bodies violently shivered from exhaustion. Nobody spoke as they slowly dragged themselves down the empty road toward the outfitter shop where they had parked their car. Their clothes were torn to shreds, and their hands were coated in dried blood and that awful black substance from the axe wound. When they reached the dirt lot, the old man who owned the shop was already standing outside with a steaming mug of coffee. He didn't look surprised to see them emerge from the woods looking like half-dead animals, nor did he ask what had happened to their gear. The old man simply took a slow sip from his mug, turned his back on the three traumatized hikers, and walked inside to flip the open sign. He knew exactly what hunted in those upper ridges, and he had sent them up there as a sacrifice to keep the town safe for another season. Vance fumbled with his car keys, his hands shaking so violently he could barely unlock the doors of his SUV. They crammed into the vehicle without a word, slamming the doors shut and locking them against the quiet morning air. Elias stared blankly out the passenger window, his nose still leaking a steady stream of dark blood onto his ruined jacket. Theron sat in the back seat, clutching his knees to his chest while rocking back and forth in a state of absolute catatonia. The drive back to civilization was entirely silent, save for the rhythmic thumping of the tires against the cracked highway. None of them dared to look in the rearview mirror, terrified that a tall figure in a canvas coat might be standing in the middle of the road. Physical escape from that anomaly was only the beginning of a much longer, darker nightmare for the three men. The deep puncture wounds on Vance's hands where the roots had torn his skin never healed properly, constantly leaking a foul-smelling clear fluid. Elias developed severe auditory hallucinations, often waking up screaming because he heard his own voice whispering from the dark corners of his bedroom. Theron sold his house and moved to a high-rise apartment in the center of the city, completely terrified of being anywhere near the ground floor. They threw away all their camping gear and deleted every map application on their phones, desperately trying to erase their past lives. The bond that had kept them friends for over a decade completely disintegrated, replaced by the shared, unspoken horror of what they had seen. You can try to rationalize a bear attack, a severe storm, or a bad fall, but you cannot process encountering something that defies physical reality. The woods do not care about your expensive boots, your satellite phones, or your years of tracking experience. There are ancient, shifting territories out there that operate on rules we cannot comprehend, guarded by things that only wear our shape as a disguise. When you step off the pavement and into the deep timber, you are entering a food chain that has existed long before humanity built its first fire. If you ever feel the gravity shift or notice the birds completely vanish from the canopy, do not wait around to figure out why. Just drop everything you are carrying and run as fast as you can back toward the safety of the concrete. Thank you for tuning in tonight, and remember to keep your doors locked and your blinds drawn tight against the dark. I will be back next week with another account from the edges of the map, assuming the static does not find me first. Do not forget to check the pinned comment below for that vital survival information regarding anomalous local guides. If you ever find yourself out in the wilderness and your guide refuses to eat, walk away immediately. Some trails are better left completely unexplored, and some mysteries are meant to stay buried under the fog. Until next time, stay safe, stay on the marked path, and never trust a stranger in the deep woods.